Sorry, yes, sorry.
Now I'm just standing here because this is where I normally stand when I'm giving the talk on the history of Westport. My name is Bronach Joyce, and you're all very welcome to the Clew Bay Heritage Centre, which is run by Westport Historical Society. We're all volunteers who run it. Now this is Heritage Week, as you all know, which starts today, and we are running two events for Heritage Week. This one here, which is a commemoration of the Achill drowning tragedy, and the other one is on Tuesday night, which is a dusk walk of Westport, of eerie Westport. So it's not like our usual historical walks which we do on a Wednesday. This is a walk to various places that have eerie connections. Okay, now before we start, I'll just let you know I am not an expert on the Clew Bay tragedy. That's why I have to have a few notes. But there are experts here who should really be doing it, but I was asked to do it anyway. Now, for those of you, and I'm sure you all know, Achill Island is a very, very beautiful island. But in the 1800s, the second half of the 1800s, Achill was very, very poor. And the people living on the island were really just subsisting. A little bit of fishing and a little bit of farming. And the young people from the island used to go to Scotland in the summer to pick potatoes. And the money that they would earn picking the potatoes would keep the family alive for the winter. So it was very important. And in those days, the end of the 1800s, the way you would get from Achill to Scotland was you would take a hooker, which is a fishing boat, into Westport. And then from Westport Harbour, they would take a steamer to Scotland. Now, June 1894. Darby's Point near Achill Sound, waiting their turn to get into a curragh that would take them out to the hookers. Now there were 4 hookers, and the first one was it was called the Victory, and that was the first one to be loaded. And the people were loaded on in huge numbers, and there was later on one of the crew from another hooker gave testimony that there were so many people on the Victory that he didn't know how they could all fit. But anyway, a lot of people got on, and later it was proved that there had been 126 on this hooker. Now there is a photograph down there which you can all have a look at later, which you can see the size of that hooker. Now just imagine coming by boat from Achill to Westport. Anybody have any idea how much it would have cost, the fare, to come from Achill to Westport? 5 pence. 5 old pence. Does anybody know what 5 old pence is nowadays?
Not much.
It would be about a cent, wouldn't it? So that's what it cost to get from Achill to Westport. And then from Westport to Glasgow. Anyone have an idea how much that would have cost?
10 bob.
No?
Pound.
Too much?
2 and 6.
5 shillings.
5
So anyway, the first hooker, the Victory, managed to get into Westport Harbour. The ship that was to take them, the steamer that was to take them to Glasgow, it was called the Elm, and that was grounded a bit outside the harbour here, and it was waiting for the tide to come in to refloat it. And as the hooker arrived and the steamer came into view, the young people, because they were nearly all young on this hooker, they got so excited when they saw the size of the steamer that was to take them to Scotland. They rushed to one side, the fishing boat overturned, and a lot of them were washed into the sea, and they were trapped by the sails. And even though there were some small boats came to their aid, a lot of them were drowned. 32 of them were drowned in sight of the harbour. Now, as I said, there were quite a few small boats went out to their aid, and there was 2 17-year-old boys, and one was called Daniel Burke and the other was Edward O'Malley. and they had been sent on a message out to the helm, the steamer. So they went out to the Elm and they boarded the steamer and they watched the approach of the hooker. Now, this is a statement made by Edward O'Malley. He said, all of a sudden, as it came nearer, it changed its course and we were struck, almost lifeless, as we saw it capsize. The water was a struggling, screaming mass of human beings. Some were grabbing their companions in order to try and save themselves, but the inevitable result was they were dragging one another underneath. Daniel Burke and I jumped into our boat and pulled away from the steamer to help in the rescue operation. We kept hauling as many as we could out of the water and into our boat, while several others clung to the gunwales. In a few minutes, our boat was packed with water-sodden people, men and women. We must have had over 24 of them. In the excitement, we did not realise that we were near to providing another tragedy, for with our cargo and those clinging onto the sides, the water was pouring over the gunwales and the boat was nearly awash. Fortunately, a stevedore on the steamer was quick to realise our plight, and jumping into a boat, he pulled over to us and took off some of those on our boat, as well as those clinging to the side. Some of the sailors tried to release some of the unfortunate victims who were trapped beneath the sails, and though they were successful in extricating a few, they were powerless to release the others owing to the weight of the sodden sails. I remember looking in that direction while we were rescuing others, and I could see the heads of the submerged one being pressed up against the sails in their brief but vain struggle for survival. The bulge of each head in the sail reminded me of a football. Isn't that a terrible image to come? Now those two lads, the O'Malley and the Burke, there are descendants of those families here today. So the Clarkes are descended from the O'Malleys, and the Burkes are descended from the Burkes. So they brought their load of survivors into the quay, and they were later awarded the gold medal of the Royal Humane Society. Now nobody seems to know where those gold medals are, but we do have a photograph of them, which I'll pass around later. Now, inside an hour and a half from what had occurred, 18 bodies had been taken out of the water, and they were all laid out along where they were laid in one of the warehouses there along the quay, one of the empty warehouses. So just then later on in the afternoon, 12 more bodies were found. So that brought the total at that stage to 30. Now the railway line from Westport to Achill was ready to open, but it hadn't opened. It was due to open very shortly. It hadn't opened. So the Justice of the Peace from Westport, his name also is O'Malley, and he contacted a man called Tatlow, who was a manager of the Midland West Railway, to ask if it would be possible to put on a train to bring the bodies back to Achill. So Mr. Tatlow agreed, but he said they could only go as far as Newport, because the rest of the railway line from Newport to Achill hadn't been handed over to his company yet. But Mr. Horn, who was the resident magistrate for this area, he sent an armed policeman down to Newport to talk to the engineers to see if they would allow the railway line to be opened, and they did. So the bodies were brought that evening. The 30 bodies were brought from the quay here to the quay railway station, and they were put on trucks and then brought to the station in Altamont Street. And at that stage then, 2 more bodies had been found. So that brought the total to 32. And it was announced that the next morning the train would leave for Achill. at 10 o'clock. So I went as far as Achill, and I'll just give you the Mayo News report on the funeral. At Achill Sound, which we reached at 10 o'clock. Now, remember, they left at 10, but all along the way, people were coming out to sympathise with people on the train. We reached at 10 o'clock. The whole country round was black with people. The cries which rent the air and the scene generally was appalling. The train stopped amidst a large crowd who surrounded it. Relieving Officer Lavelle had a large number of carts ready to convey the bodies to the cemetery. Each survivor, on leaving the train, was embraced by relatives. The relatives of the victims were frantic with grief and rent the air with their sad cries. As each coffin was removed, Mr. Gray Jr. announced the name on the lid, and this was followed by a cry of woe from the respective knots of relatives. Black flags marked the way across the bridge and under the route to Kildownit Cemetery. And I mean, Kildownit is quite a distance from Achill Sound, but everybody walked. A thick mist had begun to fall some time before. As the first shovelfuls of earth fell upon the coffins, the rain fell more heavily, and a fierce storm arose, and the wind shrieking over the mountainside and along the valleys of Achill seemed to wail in sympathy with the poor, sorrow-laden islanders. So that was the report of the tragedy, and I think Jerry, you're going to read a poem.
Indeed.
If you would.
It's about the deserted village, but it does incorporate immigration from Achill as well. Curlew calls over the lake as the rain clears. Brittle wisps hiss like phone wires to an island. Low cloud communicates with famine ridges. And in the ruins I imagine thin limbs of victims outstretched to bridge the time. In shame I retreat alone, their grandchildren, grandnephews and nieces aging gracefully now along the banks of the Clyde. Diminished grass is slowly consumed, rushes enjoy a sinister revenge, their creeping paralysis rootless even in the most sacred places. In the distance a figure approaches, stumbles across the bog onto a track. It disappears now and then in the hollows, smoke like some Moroccan street trader. He offers me a load of breast turf, as if a boatload of emigrants wouldn't tilt into the sea, as if magpies wouldn't pick our eyes out, as if grass wouldn't melt in our mouths.
Thank you, Jerry. Now, the plan originally was that we would to do most of this down at the monument, but with the weather the way it was, we decided it was better to do most of it in here. But now we're going to go down to the monument, and the Clarke children, descendants of Edward O'Malley, and the Burke children are going to lay wreaths at the monument.
Some sandwiches and tea and coffee. I can tell herself.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
That's very nice. Yeah.
Just like on behalf of Westport Historical Society to welcome everybody here, especially the people who have come from Achill who may have family connections with the people involved, and the people connected with the rescuers, especially on the O'Malley side. The O'Malleys we have here, Pierce and Morris, and we have Arthur Bell, who has come especially from England, who is on the O'Malley side as well as the Clarke family. And then on the Burke family side, we have the Burkes and we have the Greys, and possibly more, I'm not sure. But you're all very welcome. I'd just like to say that for the laying of the wreaths, the Burkes, Shifra, DJ, Elena, and Daria will bring the wreaths, and Chloe and Kiva Clarke will bring on the O'Malley side. So we'll move up now to the monument. Remember,